Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the last day of November in the year 2015. It is the 30th day of November, and it is a pleasure to be with you here in the Virtual Center on a Monday. As you recall, last week with technical difficulties, we were unable to broadcast live Monday or Tuesday last week. So our only program, live program, was on Wednesday, and I can, since many of you who are listening now know, last week was Bob Kincaid and the folks who work in the Hit On Studios with him were working on Bob substituting for Mike Malloy through the week, and at a different time from 9 to midnight. And it was the technology associated with that transition that made it difficult, made it impossible for us to do our live programs on Monday and Tuesday. They had a lot of technical work to do in streamlining the broadcast and getting the, I'm talking about something I know absolutely nothing about, so please forgive me, But the point is, they were backed up for time in the studios and had a difficult time with that facing them last Monday night and again on Tuesday. So by the time the third day rolled around, the third night of Bob's substitution rolled around, it seemed to be running very smoothly. And as many of you have told me in an email, and I appreciate it so much, I was privileged to spend 1 hour with Bob Friday night on the Malloy program from the 10 to 11 slot, and I enjoyed it immensely. I thought they did a fabulous job, and it's quite a transition from this kind of a format to that one. Bob and I were just sharing comments about that before we came on the air today. It's a whole different situation, primarily because of the so-called hard breaks, the commercial breaks that are so necessary on a program like that. And what that means is that the conversation just doesn't roll along without periodic breaks, and it's very difficult from the host's perspective. It's very difficult to conduct a program where you're getting into something intellectually and cognitively, with the idea that you have to keep stopping and breaking your train of thought for purposes of commercials, and then come back and to restart is very, very difficult. And to do that, almost every 12 to 13 minutes, which is what Bob had to do last week, I think is very, very difficult. It really changes the way you prepare. It changes the nature of the entire presentation. You don't have the time, the luxury of time to build up a particular issue or to develop background of a particular issue unless you do it in segments. And even then, each time you return to the air, it seems to me, you have to do a little bit of a review in order to pick up and move on. So it requires a totally different preparation for a program like that. I thought Bob handled it very, very well. And I think he would agree, I know I did, that the people who do that regularly and do it well are to be commended, because it's not easy. A lot of people think that the breaks give the host or whatever on a program like that 2 or 3 minutes off every 15 minutes. But the fact of the matter is, if you're trying to develop an idea or a perspective, it's a little bit difficult to do that with periodic breaks in your train of thought, so to speak. I know that in all the years that I was teaching, at the beginning, of course, like anybody else, I relied on notes in class. But over the last several years that I was teaching, I did it without notes. I was really trying to make the presentation, make the class sound as natural and free-flowing as possible. And I didn't like the idea of constantly referring to notes all the time. Now, it's different because if you're quoting, if you're doing some extensive quoting, you have to rely on the notes because you're reading, and we understand that. But I think everybody would agree that a presentation for any length of time where the presenter merely is reading from written copy is pretty deadly. And so in order to avoid that, I tried to develop my classes in such a way that I wouldn't rely on notes. And what I used to do basically was just put a very brief outline on the blackboard in the old days, the blackboard, now the whiteboard, I guess. But rather just 3 or 4 topics. And of course, I was just trying to make, primarily it appeared that I was doing that for the benefit of the students, but in actual fact, it was for my benefit as well, because it basically outlined the major points that I wanted to make in the order in which I wanted to make them. And I would rely on that brief outline quite a bit. But beyond that, I tried as much as possible not to be overly reliant on notes. I do that here on the Virtual Center. I spend an awful lot of time excuse me a moment. I spend quite a bit of time putting the program together, but when I go on the air, I try as much as possible to do it with as little reliance on notes as possible. But as we'll see today, if I'm dealing with text and I want to be, I want to protect the integrity of the text. If somebody makes a point, I want those people to get credit for that point. And so rather than paraphrase it, oftentimes I will go and quote the passage where the particular point is made, because I don't want to risk any tampering in any way with the idea of the original thought, because I think it's important to attribute original creative thinking to the person who did it. And to be honest with you, that's going to be one of the issues that I think we'll be dealing with very, very early in today's program. This being the first program of the week, I'd like to open, as we usually do, by sharing with you our phone numbers and my email address, and encourage you to participate actively in our program by feeling very, very comfortable picking up the phone and calling in and sharing your ideas, your thoughts, your comments, your questions, whatever they might be on the issues of the day. We would love to hear from you. I know our listeners would. It makes a difference when you're listening to a different voice. The more interaction and conversation there is, the stronger the program becomes naturally. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. Briefly, over the last couple of weeks, we were using I was giving you a different number, but this is the one we have traditionally used, and it's now in service. It's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to address your thoughts directly to me one-on-one in an email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I remind you that we have a page on Facebook. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page, and there's quite a bit on there. I've taken, especially last week, I took to putting material on Facebook quite frequently. This weekend, I don't think I put that much on. And part of the reason was I was really uncertain as to where we would go at the beginning of the program. I wanted to, if I do put something on Facebook, I'd like it to refer to either a program that was just completed at the Virtual Center, or one or a preview to an upcoming program. And since I was spending the weekend scouting around trying to come up with themes, I wasn't exactly sure which way we would be going. So the fact of the matter is, I thought about putting something on this morning and I didn't. But I probably will be at the conclusion of today's program sometime this evening. But again, if you do go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page, and there is quite a bit of information and literature on it that I hope you will find interesting, and I do invite you to feel comfortable to make comments or suggestions or whatever. Pick up the phone and make reference to something that you saw on our Facebook page or whatever. I would love to hear from you, and I in advance I thank you for being willing to even take the time to do that.
Bill, I'm sorry for the interruption.
Yes.
The phone won't be in use today. It'll be back in use tomorrow.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Agnes. So forget the phone calls today. So I'm going to have to rely on the fact that this is going to be a solo flight. And, I do anticipate each time we come on the air, I enjoy the calls, and I do hope that we will receive one. But I do understand that. Let me, before getting into what I think will be the first topic in today's program, I mentioned the email, and I received an email this weekend from a good friend, an old friend of the Virtual Center, Harry, who's based in Baltimore, and he sent me some information. If you recall, several months ago, Harry was principally responsible for sending me a lot of information on the attack on science, the so-called attack on truth. We spent quite a bit of time on that. And I tried at the time to give Harry all the credit in the world. This is an area that he's particularly interested in, the area of science. We spent quite a bit of time on climate, if you remember, in the attack on science related to climate, which I think is quite timely, given the fact that there's an international conference on climate scheduled for Paris this week. And I know that all of us will be keeping one eye on that. And then we spent quite a bit of time on fossil fuels and the role of corporate involvement in trying to counter some of the scientific research associated with what the burning of fossil fuels was doing to the environment. Harry sent me some information this week on and did so with due apologies, but his point was that it's a similar thing. It may not strike people as being significant as the issue of either climate and the burning of fossil fuels, but it's the sugar industry and the role that Coca-Cola, the corporation, is playing in the nation's struggles with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and all the rest of it, and the role that sugar plays in that, and abuse of sugar plays in that. And he sent me quite a bit of good information on it, and I have spent some time on that information, but I'm not quite ready to introduce it yet. But I did want to acknowledge the fact that I did receive it, and I wanted to thank Harry ahead of time for his thoughtfulness in sending that. So I'm guessing that perhaps one day this week we'll spend a little bit of time on that, because I think it's quite interesting and quite revealing as well. In the Charleston Gazette, which is West Virginia's state newspaper, in its Sunday edition yesterday, there was an article on higher education, specifically higher education in West Virginia. And it was an article written by a good friend, former colleague of mine, and continues to be one of my closest friends. And it was a follow-up to the article that I had in there a couple of weeks ago, that I had put in the Gazette on higher education, and more specifically higher education in West Virginia. And John's purpose, the author is John Thaxton, and his article, the title in the presentation in the Gazette was that West Virginia must take higher education to potential students. And this is pretty much a follow-up or continuation on the argument that I have, which I spent quite a bit of time on here, I believe at the beginning of not this past week, but the week before that, 2 weeks ago, based on the piece that I had in the Charleston Gazette on higher education. And John's piece was written directly based on some of the things that I had said. And to be honest with you, it was not, John's piece did not criticize much of what I said. In fact, for the most part, it elaborated on and tried to sustain or to support many of the things that I have said. And in the course of his article in yesterday's paper, John made reference to the fact that there was as long ago as 6 years ago, there was a group that, including John, a group of folks got together and proposed a business plan, developed a business plan based on this idea of delivering higher education to citizens in a rural state like West Virginia, where the geography, because of the mountains, and I say that advisedly because we've done so much damage to the mountains, that some people raise questions of whether West Virginia will remain the mountain state. But based on the environmental difficulties of delivering traditional in-seat instruction in a rural state like this, where the geography is not conducive to readily conducive to easy transportation and delivery, John mentions the fact that a group of people had put together a business plan for a different approach to the delivery of higher education in West Virginia. And I will say that I was a member of that group. It was a very small group of us, 4 or 5 of us, to be honest with you, that sat down and developed a business plan, and we made a number of efforts to find ways to introduce this to the citizens of West Virginia and to the people who make these kinds of decisions in West Virginia. And we continue to struggle with this. Anyway, John's article was pretty much based on the model that we developed. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of today's program here at the Virtual Center on John's article for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think it's worthy of attention. It's a good job. More importantly, I believe that the message in it is quite significant. John is not saying anything that I don't support, and I didn't say anything a couple of weeks ago that he doesn't support either, because for the last several years, we've been working in tandem with our thinking going in the same direction. John's article in yesterday's Gazette really put in a lot of the details that I didn't take the time to present 2 weeks ago. I was presenting the basic argument of delivering education to students who traditionally are not considered to be qualified to avail themselves of higher education. In other words, students who could not meet current admission standards for most colleges and universities. And one of the major points that I made, and I'm not going to spend much time on what I wrote because I want to spend most of it on what John wrote. But one of the points that I made, and John reinforced it, is the fact that higher education traditionally tends to focus more on the institutions than on the students to be served. And this is, it seems to be easy to understand, but philosophically, it's very, very hard to keep the two separate. Obviously, an institution goes into existence primarily to achieve a particular purpose. And theoretically, all the people who work in that particular institution are driven to function in the same direction, with the goal or the objective being the satisfaction or the addressing of the purpose for which the institution was created. But over time, institutions, by definition, tend to become so fixed on what they do and how they do it that literally the priorities of the institution oftentimes substitute themselves for the objectives for which it was created. And much of the policies and much of the creativity that goes into an institution, into fundraising and all the rest of it, is driven primarily about supporting the mission of the institution and theoretically accepting the fact that the purpose for which the institution was created remains a good one, remains noble, remains worthy of pursuit. But the fact of the matter is, as often as not, or perhaps even more than that, it's the priorities of the institution that tend to drive the ship. And then loyalty to the institution becomes the number one objective. In theory, because if the institution is weakened, then it can't carry out its purpose as successfully. But the fact of the matter is that's often lost in the rush to strengthen and support the institution itself. And the objective of the institution, in this case we're talking about colleges and universities, the objective of the institution is assumed but rarely acknowledged and rarely addressed anymore. It's just the idea that the strength and growth and stability of the institution in and of itself becomes a worthy objective. And that's what people are basically concentrated on. And then the attention mainly goes into strengthening the image, the quality, doing everything possible to advertise the quality of the particular institution in question. Institutions are compared, they are rated, they are in competition for each other, with each other for the best students, for funding and all the rest of it. And in theory, the stronger they are and the better reputation they have and the more awards they've garnered, then theoretically the more money they'll be able to raise and all the rest of it. And so, and that was one of the points that I had made a couple of weeks ago. John didn't emphasize that, but at the same time, he acknowledged it and supported it. What John spent most of his time talking about was the delivery of higher education, especially in a rural state that's in as much economic trouble as is West Virginia. And John provided a number of pieces of information, of data, which I think are very relevant for, and I think all of it is important. First of all, about employment, about the quality of education in an area like West Virginia, especially southern West Virginia, the southern West Virginia coal fields. John points out that high school graduations in the southern coal fields in West Virginia has declined by more than 30% over the last 10 years. In an era where graduating from high school seems almost to have become a necessity, in West Virginia there's been a decline in the number of people graduating from high school, a substantial decline of something in the area of 30% over the last 10 years. And of course, one would say, well, if people don't graduate from high school, then they're not going to have the skills necessary to enter the world of employment. But the reality is, in southern West Virginia, employment has been employment in coal for a long time, to the exclusion of all others. So, as John points out, those people who had academic skills tended to leave the state, whereas the ones that are left are the ones that didn't have the academic skills to leave. Many of them knew they were going to end up going into the mines. Many of them went in there without even bothering to graduate from high school. Thus the numbers. John points out that the number of people here in southern West Virginia from 18 to 65 years of age who are actively employed, who work full-time, is less than 50%. And then he makes he makes a statement which I think all of us ought to hear. On average, 1 of every 3 people employed did not complete high school. And in one particular county, the number is 1 of every 2. What that means is that people who are working, which is less than 50% of the population of working age, 1 out of 3 didn't graduate from high school. In one county, it's 1 out of every 2. And basically, the point that John makes is those who had the credentials to find work elsewhere left. At the same time, West Virginia has more colleges and universities per capita than any other state in the Union. But the fact of the matter is, so few of West Virginia's population qualify for admission into its colleges and universities that sustaining the institution, keeping it alive, requires that these institutions hire admissions counselors to go out further and further in search of qualified students, because only by sustaining their enrollment can they sustain their very existence. And one of the issues that I raised, and John makes reference to the fact that I did raise it, has been, in this kind of a situation, getting the student into these colleges. What John is talking about is reversing this issue, namely finding a way to deliver education to the potential student rather than insisting that the student physically come to the institution. As John points out, in West Virginia, there's a substantial unserved population of uneducated or undereducated adults. John identifies the fact that of this potential unserved student population, 60% of them would be classified as adults. And here in West Virginia, because of the physical nature of the state, getting the student to the institution of higher education is becoming increasingly difficult. It's clearly impossible if 60% of your potential student body are adults. Then getting them to the institutions becomes impossible. So therefore, what we were doing, and what John writes about, is looking at the issue from the other direction. How to deliver the product to the student and do it well and in a way which is cost-effective and efficient. The challenge then, how do we find ways to deliver quality higher education to adults in a rural, difficult-to-navigate environment? Now, the answer, and some people are probably thinking this already, is technology. Online instruction, distance learning. There's absolutely no question that that's important. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize not only the advantages of technology in instruction, but the drawbacks or the negatives. It has been shown time and again, and the research validates this over and over again, that there are quality issues, serious quality issues, associated with exclusively online instruction. Many colleges and universities throughout the country offer online classes. Many of them feature online degree programs. But the fact of the matter is, there are quality issues associated with this. And I don't necessarily want to spend all of our time on that particular issue. But it is an important one. It is very, very important. One of the things that we've learned in our research, I've learned in mine, is that if you look at some of the best institutions we have, Ivy League schools, for example, the one that I spend a lot of time on, I've mentioned before here, is West Point, the military academy at West Point. What you find is that these high-quality institutions recognize and value the on-site learning experience. There's absolutely no substitute for the interaction that happens when people are learning together. That's why I spend as much time as I do encouraging calls and utilizing that phone number. Because I recognize that the quality of the learning experience is enhanced immeasurably by the give and take, by conversation, by back and forth, by exposing ideas, new ideas, to a larger audience and encouraging feedback on those particular ideas. The more of that interaction and dialogue that happens, the better the learning experience. All the data shows that. So the issue for most people that take education, the quality of education, very seriously, most people recognize that technology brings a whole new dimension to learning, no question. But it's important to find ways to maximize that learning experience by finding ways to incorporate some of the strengths of the traditional interactive learning environment. I believe, and I have shared this with any number of people, I believe that here at the Virtual Center, what we are doing in some of our programs is enacting or performing almost a case study in the linkage between technology and learning. The conversation is critical. The shared learning experience is critical. But one must recognize that learning can happen even when the conversation isn't there. If the learning experience is organized and developed and delivered in such a way that cognitively challenging intellectual exercises occur. I really believe that we've had a number of those experiences here at the Virtual Center over the weeks and months that we've been doing this. I think that in many ways we are validating the linkage between technology and quality learning experiences. But at the same time, I recognize that if you can find a way to add dialogue to this, to bring more people to the table, so to speak, the quality of the educational product increases. And I've tried, during calls that we've had here at the Virtual Center, I try to make a point whenever I can to emphasize what the particular conversation has brought to the learning experience. How all of us learn because of the back and forth and the interaction that takes place. So again, I think the issue that we're looking at here is an important one. Learning is enhanced by conversation and dialogue and interaction. But learning without it is not impossible. And I think we need to recognize both of those things. I have mentioned in the past the Supreme Court decision I believe it was in the 1950s. I think the case was McLaren versus Oklahoma, if I'm not mistaken, about law school, about integrated law schools at the University of Oklahoma. And the Supreme Court made a ruling that the segregated nature of the law school at the University of Oklahoma at this particular point in time, which I believe was the early 1950s, made the quality of education for non-whites impossible. The court's ruling pointed out that if you segregate a particular student from the rest of the group, for whatever reason, but in this case it was race, even if the student is privy to what's happening in the institution, denying the student the opportunities to interact with colleagues and to share thinking and share ideas and bounce ideas back and forth means that by definition, segregated education is not equal education. That case was a finding for integration in law school. But the principle that that case reveals, it seems to me, is an important one. Namely, that dialogue and interaction is necessary because education suffers without it. Doesn't mean that education can't happen without it, but it means that the quality of that education is demeaned, is lessened thereby. Okay. So what then is, back to John Thaxton's article in yesterday's Charleston Gazette. What exactly is John talking about? What John is talking about is something that we refer to, and I think this is self-explanatory, but I'll elaborate on it in a minute. John is talking about something called lecture capture. And that involves technology. The ability to record on-site in-class lecture and then to make that video available off-site. That way you can transfer the learning that happens on campus, off campus. There was a lot of concern about that because the assumption was that students off campus would merely be sitting there watching a video. And we all know that there's a difference between living life and watching it. We all know when it comes to television, for example, that people who witness something on video, on television or in the movies, do not engage to the degree that people living it engage in it. The benefits of reading, as opposed, in the 50s and 60s, for example, there was a lot of thinking that television would revolutionize classroom teaching. But it became clear very quickly that if you sit there watching something on television, doesn't matter how good it is, you do not intellectually engage it. You do not cognitively engage it. You merely view it. I have long believed that radio has greater learning potential than video, because listening to something and processing it is much more active, much more cognitively activating than is watching it. So the lectures, a lot of people who have known about lecture capture, videotaping my class on a particular issue, for example, and then making that video available at an off-site location to another group of students that I've never even met. The key, of course, is the learning experience that happens on site. It's one thing if you're asking off-site students to merely view the video, because what happens is that they never actually engage it. They never cognitively engage it. They're disengaged intellectually. They may enjoy it. They may find it interesting for a while, but there's no way that they can remain cognitively engaged beyond a very limited amount of time. So consequently, the key is what happens on site. And that means the presence on site of a facilitator. Doesn't have to be a professor. It could be a high school teacher. It could be a student who had that particular course before. The key is if the lecture is offered not as lecture, but as a source. If people in the on-site location are required to engage the video rather than merely watch it and listen to it. And basically, what the potential here is the ability to deliver something approaching, not equaling, but approaching quality higher education to people at distant sites. People who would be taking a particular class with neighbors, with friends, people from their own districts. It would involve utilizing local high schools and middle schools in off hours. In other words, people would come to a site. The difference is they wouldn't have to come to a college campus, which could be an hour and a half or 2 hours away. Rather, they would go to a facility, a local high school or middle school in their region. And the only other people in the class would be people from that same region. And amongst them would be a facilitator of some sort. The video would not be the class. The video would be a resource for the class. And the instructor who was videotaped, who delivered the original class, would become much more than an instructor. Basically, what this involves, what this lecture capture concept involves, is turning every class into an academic enterprise, into an educational enterprise. The instructor teaching the class and delivering the lecture at the college or university would not only be the teacher, he would also be a manager. He would also be a curriculum development specialist, because it would be up to that person to work with the facilitators at the various sites to make sure that they raise the right questions and asked on-site students to engage the lecture in the right ways. In a sense, the lead instructor would be working with a number of instructional assistants, graduate assistants, for example, who would be on-site facilitators. And the lecture would become part of the on-site class, but only part of it. And it would be up to the on-site facilitator to incorporate the lecture as a resource in the overall learning experience and direct student attention to cognitively engaging the videotaped lecture that was being presented. This would make it possible to deliver in-seat education to large numbers of people in various sites in cohort fashion, where these groups, these local groups, would become cohorts. They would all be there from the same region for the same purpose. They would support each other. They would help each other. They would kind of form a community, a learning community, if you will, within the class. Therefore, they would be providing a support system for each individual in that group. You would be less likely to lose students. People would be less likely to drop out because it would become kind of a group effort, something to look forward to each week or each night, however the thing was organized. But since the lecture is captured, since it exists on video, you don't have to start the class at any particular time. Whenever a cohort emerged, you could begin the class. You could have a variety of cohorts in rural areas beginning and ending at different times. And you would basically put the individual student more in control of their own planning of their educational experience. Some students might only want to take on one class. Others might want to do 2 or 3 classes. And because so many of these courses were captured in the can, so to speak, they could stop and start at any time that was convenient for the person taking it, for the students. So all you would have to do would be to announce locally that a cohort class in whatever the subject happened to be would be beginning a week from Monday night, for example, at the middle school or at the elementary school or at the high school or whatever. In places where this has been done successfully, what the data shows is that the retention rate approaches 90%. Few people quit. Quite a difference from online classes, where the data shows that the dropout rate in most online classes exceeds 90%. Students are so disengaged from online courses that they find it very difficult to develop the motivation to even finish. We've all seen, I do believe, stories about these so-called MOOCs, M-O-O-C, massive online courses, that are being offered free by many Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Colgate, Cornell. Many of these institutions offer these MOOCs, massive online courses, which enroll 10,000 students from around the world. But what the data shows is that while thousands of students register for these classes, very, very, very few students ever finish them. There's nothing that keeps one going like being a member of a group. So somehow, you've got to take that experience, that group experience, and find a way to deliver it in challenging rural environments. That's what John's article was about yesterday. He didn't go into the details of the lecture capture. That I just did. But John points out that it has been tried successfully. It was developed, the technology for this was developed 30 years ago at MIT. MIT still uses it. Many institutions use it. Many professions use it. Engineers, for example, use it. And John raises some questions. Is it complex? Yes. Does it require a lot of hard work and creativity and organizational work? Yes. Is it worth the time? All the data suggests indeed it is worth it. The cost of delivery is minimal. You can do this and charge lower tuition. Not only that, but because a lot of the material for the class is on the taped lectures, and because the tape is there, students can watch it over and over and over again in their own time until they have mastered whatever the material is. This is the trick. This is, we believe, and I believe, the answer. It bothers a lot of people in the profession for a number of reasons. One of them is being taped. A lot of instructors don't want their performances taped. They don't want people outside the classroom to see or hear what they say and what they do in class. But on the other hand, to make a system like this work, you don't need every faculty member to participate. You don't want every faculty member. Some of them are pretty god-awful teachers. This gives you the opportunity to select your very best, put them on tape, and make the tape readily available throughout the region. Sometimes you can play to the vanity of certain faculty. They love it. Many faculty members who are prima donnas in the classroom, or think they could be, love the idea of being taped and videoed and looked at time and time again by audiences all over the place. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both. There's also the issue of intellectual property, the legal issues of intellectual property. I think all of these things can be worked out. The fact of the matter is, it's not an untried system. It's been tried, and it's been found to work. It's not equal to the on-site residential experience of a good college education. But on the other hand, in a state like West Virginia, we're dealing with a population that's not able currently to access the available higher education in their own state. We have colleges everywhere in West Virginia, but so many in this state don't meet the admissions requirements. This particular system makes it possible to get people ready, to qualify people for admission. What you are basically doing is strengthening the enrollment potential of institutions that are already here by capturing the uneducated and undereducated adult population surrounding them. John's final comment is one that I thought I would share with you. He says, even more important, this process has the advantage of enhancing the quality and the effectiveness of the traditional in-seat four walls process. And the question that I asked when I read that is how? How does this system, this lecture capture cohort idea, potentially enhance the in-class experience of what's going on in our current colleges and universities? I believe an answer to that question is the fact that the vast majority of people who would take advantage of this are adults. As much as possible in a state like West Virginia with an economy as poor as West Virginia's, these adults could be working adults. They could be adults who have been in the military. What you are potentially doing, it seems to me, is enhancing the adult population at our existing colleges and universities by qualifying undereducated, unqualified adults so that they are qualified. And again, if you want to have admissions tests and administer college boards or whatever else, and force these people to meet existing qualifications, fine. Because if you do this well, these people will be able to meet admissions qualifications, as long as they don't have to do it before they turn 18 years old. Anybody who has taught a class knows what adult students bring to the classroom in terms of experience, real-world experience. The good teachers are able to incorporate the experience of the adult students in the class into the course itself. Because many of these people bring experiences to the classroom that everybody in there will benefit from. The whole quality of the in-class experience is increased by having adults in it. The other thing is, these people don't quit. Once these people begin, they will finish. The cohort organizational process strengthens that likelihood. But the fact of the matter is, these people don't drop out. Which means that for the most part, those who begin finish. You would be increasing the graduation rates. You would be enhancing the quality of the in-class experience for all students. You would be qualifying people who up to this point are being left out, are being not even given a chance. And in the process, you'd be developing the kind of a qualified, educated workforce so necessary to turn a region like this around. That's the process. And that's what I recommend. That's what John Thaxton recommends. But I have to tell you, even though we are different people, we have been so close on this issue for so long that I think we even have reached the point where I can guess the next sentence to come out of John's mouth, and he can guess the next the next thing to come out of mine when this is the subject. We have reached the top of the hour. We have completed our first hour here on this Monday edition of the Virtual Center. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. It's about 4 minutes after the hour, so we've gone a little bit over. But we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll get into a totally different issue in our second hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a brief break, We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome to the second hour of this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. It is such a pleasure to be with you on this Monday. Today is the last day of November 30th. We do invite you to participate in our program. We just finished an issue on higher education. I just want to go back and once we do the housekeeping chores at the beginning of the hour, I'd like to go back and cite for you the address if you'd like to read John Thaxton's piece in yesterday's Charleston Gazette. I think it's well worth your time. If you would like to call and make comment or ask questions or make suggestions or challenge some of the issues that we had in our first hour, we would love to hear from you. We all would. The phone number, I believe we're going to pass on the phone today. I think Agnes told us at the start of the first hour that we would not have the phones. They would be back up again tomorrow. So that's fine. But if you would like to drop me an email, I sure would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And again, I remind you of our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be on our Facebook page. And there are a number of pieces and articles and issues addressed there that I think will be of interest to you, since most of them are issues that came to life here at the Virtual Center. And so I do trust that your time would be well spent at looking at any number of these. Please feel free to comment on them, either with an email, a call at a future program, or something like that. We would love to hear from you. In our first hour, if you are just joining us, first of all, I want to welcome you to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you've been with us since our program began over an hour ago, I want to thank you for staying with us. But especially for the new folks, if you are interested in checking on the article that we focused on during our first hour, the idea of lecture capture as a way to deliver quality higher education in a rural area like southern West Virginia, you can go to yesterday's Charleston Gazette. On your search engine, that would be wvgazette.com. Just go to wvgazette.com, and when it comes up, just type in opinion. And when you get opinion, you will see Gazette op-ed pieces and letters. And just type in, just hit the Gazette, and they are listed in the op-ed pieces in Sunday, the 29th day of November's Charleston Gazette. You will see the article by John B. Thaxton on West Virginia higher education. I think it's a good read. I think you will enjoy it. I recommend it. And I'd like to thank John for it. I'd like to, in this our second hour, I'd like to introduce an issue which I think will probably hold our attention beyond today's program. I've done a little bit of scouting this morning before we came on the air today, and I found quite a bit of information. There's quite a bit of research to be done on this particular issue. But it is so important, potentially so important, so significant, and so relevant to the mission of the Virtual Center that it's one I think all of us must take the time to address, to reflect upon, to think through, and yes, to watch very carefully, because I think it's a very, very important issue. What caused me to come across this issue at all was a piece in Friday's Washington Post, an article by George Will, who's a regular columnist in the Washington Post, has been since 1974, I believe. Many of you will know, of course, that George Will is one of the most noted op-ed commentators in journalism today. He, in fact, won a Pulitzer Prize for his columns in 1977. He is frequently cited by contemporary conservatives as being kind of a voice or the spokesman. Many people put him into the category of William Buckley. I don't know whether that is totally accurate or not, but there's absolutely no question that philosophically and in other ways, in terms of his skills and his writing ability, it can be argued that he belongs there. In his column on Friday, the 27th, I guess that was Friday, in the Washington Post, the title of his article, Battling the Modern American Administrative State, unquote. Battling the Modern American Administrative State. I believe the issues raised in this article warrant our attention, our serious attention, our time, thought, research, and conversation. I trust you will agree. It doesn't bother me whether one recognizes George Will to be a conservative spokesman or not. I think what you will find is that there's quite a lot to be gained by touching base, even with people you don't agree with philosophically, in order to get some idea where they are, where their thinking is, where they might be going politically, administratively, or intellectually. I think it's very helpful. I think we can all learn something from that. I hope that addressing some of these issues and spending time on this particular issue here at the Virtual Center turns out to be something that you find very worthwhile. Obviously, the title of the article, Battling the Modern American Administrative State, raises some interesting questions. The whole idea of the administrative state. Let's spend a little bit of time getting our arms around what George Will is talking about. I think one of the first things you're going to note is that George Will sets out to give a lot of credibility and a lot of thanks to Justice Clarence Thomas. Many people believe that Justice Thomas is probably the weakest of the 9 justices on our Supreme Court. And a lot of that is because he doesn't write a whole lot. He doesn't speak a whole lot. Much of his activity is in concurring cases or tying into the sense that other people write. He's obviously, voting-wise, an ally of Justice Scalia, Justice Alito, Chief Justice Roberts in today's court. However, what George Will is pointing out to us in this article, and I'll clarify a lot of this in a moment, is that on this particular issue of the administrative state and the challenge to the administrative state, Justice Thomas seems to be asserting himself more often than on most other issues. In fact, Will points out that in 4 court opinions in this last session, between the 9th of March and the 29th of June, 112 days, there were 4 different opinions that the court ruled on related to the issue of the American administrative state. And in these cases, Justice Thomas was very visible. He didn't write the majority opinion, but he took the time to put together lengthy, well-written, concurring opinions in at least a couple of these cases. I've read 2 of them. The subject, George Will says, deals with the court's whole separation of powers issue. In one of the Supreme Court cases just mentioned, the title of which is Department of Transportation versus the Association of American Railroads, this case was decided in last year, 2014. So these are all decisions in the last court session that ended at the end of June. This is a statement from one of the concurring opinions that Justice Thomas wrote in the case of Department of Transportation versus the Association of American Railroads. The Constitution, Justice Thomas says, does not vest the federal government with an undifferentiated governmental power, unquote. I think that's a very, very important point that Thomas makes. The Constitution of the United States obviously gives power to the federal government, but the power that is given to the federal government is not, in Thomas's words, undifferentiated. Rather, it vests 3 distinctive types of power to 3 different branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. It's not just power that the federal government will decide how to distribute and who gets what. In theory, the Constitution is rather specific in saying the legislative branch of government will have the power to do these things. The executive branch of government will have the power to do these things. The judicial branch will have the power to do very specific things. What Thomas says in his concurring opinion in the Department of Transportation case is that there's a difference between making law and putting law into effect. As we know, the legislative branch of government makes the law. It passes the law. The executive branch of government executes it, carries it out, implements it. Those are not the same. The point Thomas is making. Those are different kinds of power entirely. The Constitution distinguishes between those kinds of powers. What bothers Justice Thomas is the degree to which Congress is delegating its powers in many cases to the executive branch. More specifically, to executive agencies, to particular agencies of the executive branch. Agencies which theoretically report to the president. They're part of the executive branch. But they didn't exist when the Constitution was written. So the consideration, the realization that one must draw is that there's no way in the world the founders could have anticipated the growth of administrative agencies, bureaucracies, in our modern political system. What bothers Thomas is that over time, the legislature, Congress, has delegated a lot of its powers to the agencies which report to the executive, to the president. That means that many of these agencies not only carry out or implement a particular power, but in many cases they get to decide what that power is because the legislature gave them the opportunity to do that. George Will writes that this delegation of power from the legislature to the executive agencies generally erases the distinctions between making laws and putting them into effect. In other words, the very clear distinction between what legislatures do and what executive branch of government does are being lost through the process of delegating so much of the legislative authority to executive agencies. This occurs, George Will says, when Congress overextends and oftentimes too busy to be specific, delegates what Thomas calls, in his concurring opinion, policy determinations that effectively permit the president to define some or all of the some or all of the content of a rule of conduct. In other words, legislatures are delegating to an executive agency the authority to write in the details, to fill in the details on their own authority, on their own power. And Thomas's position is this violates the separation of powers in the Constitution of the United States. I'm going to read this paragraph from George Will. In it, he quotes Justice Thomas. Today, George Will writes, if Congress provides, quote, a minimal degree of specificity, unquote, that's Thomas's quote, in the instructions it gives to the executive, the court, Thomas says, abandons, quote, all pretense of enforcing a qualitative distinction between legislative and executive power. As a result, the court has overseen and sanctioned the growth of an administrative system that concentrates the power to make laws and the power to enforce them in the hands of a vast, unaccountable administrative apparatus that finds no comfortable home in our constitutional structure, unquote. To try to put all of this into succinct language that makes some sense to us, what Will is writing about, what Thomas is writing about is in his concurring opinions, is the breakdown of separation of powers, which is so critical in Madison's Constitution, as a way to break and control the violence of faction. Not only by separating government between national government and state governments and local governments and municipal governments, but also dividing power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government at different levels. And the result is that you build in, and this is Federalist number 51, Madison's argument is you create so many internal checks and balances that you make it difficult, if not impossible, for factions to get control and work the system to their own advantage. At least that's the theory. And if you remember, and I believe it's Federalist number 47, Madison made the point that his definition of tyranny is when separation of powers breaks down. When one branch of government has the power not only to make law but to implement it. That's when you have, Madison believed, a situation which leads potentially to tyranny. What Justice Thomas is saying is that because over the years Congress has delegated so much of its power to executive agencies that we have effectively created this huge bureaucracy of unaccountable public officials who report only internally to the people above them, to their supervisors and their managers, and ultimately to the president, who can't possibly know what's happening all the way up and down the line. But the fact of the matter is, there's no check. There's no accountability. There is, Thomas believes, a situation which borders on, if it's not already there, Madison's definition of tyranny in Federalist number 47. Thomas says, and this is George Will quotes Thomas, as a result of all this, Thomas says, the court has overseen and sanctioned the growth of an administrative system that concentrates the power to make laws and the power to enforce them in the hands of a vast, unaccountable administrative apparatus that finds no comfortable home in our constitutional structure. And then George Will cites a major article on this particular issue. I'm in the process of reading that article. I've read about half of it. The article is by Charles Cooper, who was in Ronald Reagan's Justice Department in the 1980s. And he has written this article, and in it, Cooper credits Justice Thomas for raising this issue, this concern, in the cases that George Will cites. Let me say, and this is not a criticism of George Will in any way, but there's absolutely no question that George Will's article is directly taken from Charles Cooper's piece in National Affairs. There are large sections of it that are Cooper's. And Cooper's article is a substantial one. It is major. And in it, Cooper does things Cooper goes to great lengths to talk about the growth of the administrative state. Let me share with you what we're talking about here. And I think you'll get some idea of why this is so important. Cooper says it's fitting that we refer to the administrative state as a state, for it has become a sovereign power unto itself, an imperium in imperio, power within a power, regulating virtually every dimension of our lives. Its nearly 450 agencies are manned by legions of bureaucrats, now numbering almost 2.7 million people. In 2013 alone, Cooper says, 3,659 final rules were issued, adding 26,417 pages to the Federal Register. So in other words, these 450 different agencies, manned by more than 2.5 million federal employees, wrote more than 3,600 final rules and added over 26,400 pages to the Federal Register. All told, Cooper says, the Code of Federal Regulations contained 175,496 pages of regulations, spread out over 235 volumes as of 2013. This represents a 7.4% increase in the number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations since President Obama came to office. And that figure doesn't include 2014 or 2015, only up through 2013. But again, 2.7 million people employed in 450 different agencies, theoretically all of them executive agencies, all of them reporting up the line, and theoretically accountable to the president only. So Cooper's whole point is, it's a huge bureaucratic structure that seems relatively unaccountable to anybody. And then when you add the fact, and this is where Thomas is coming from, according to George Will, that Congress over the years has delegated more and more of its lawmaking power to these agencies. Why? Because these agencies employ the experts, the professionals in the various fields and areas of the particular agency. For example, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates the internet, which regulates television, traditional land television, which represents traditional radio, makes the rules. Obviously, the FCC is manned by broadcast professionals, by attorneys who have specialized in communication law, in broadcasting, and in broadcast law. In theory, there's no way that the president or anybody else could bring the kind of expertise to these particular issues of communications that these experts can. Congress recognizes that. So Justice Thomas's whole point is that it is in recognition of their talent, of their skills, of their professionalism, of their professional expertise, that Congress defers the details, the specifics to them, because they're the experts. And over years, what this results in is a flow of legislative power from the legislative branch, from Congress, to the executive branch, namely to these executive agencies. And Thomas's concern, obviously, is that this process violates the separation of powers on which the founders wrote and built the Constitution of the United States. That's the issue. And what Thomas is doing is leading the court in an effort to restore the integrity of separation of powers to the judicial system. Because his concern is not only is Congress deferring to these agencies, but the court is as well. Because obviously the court doesn't feel qualified in making specific rules and regulations affecting these particular areas. We talked about the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. How about transportation? The ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in 1887 primarily to regulate railroads, interstate trade and traffic in railroading. We dealt with this before, but I think it's pertinent now. You may recall some time ago that we were talking about the ICC in the late 19th century, the Interstate Commerce Commission. We were talking about the efforts of farmers, the so-called populists in the late 80s and early 90s, who believed that they were being gouged by the railroads. Farmers absolutely depended 100% on railroads to get their crops to market. That meant that farmers were totally dependent on the rates charged by these railroads. Many farmers believed that the railroads were taking advantage of the fact that they had the monopoly, that the farmers couldn't go anywhere else to market their crop. They had to pay whatever the railroads charged. Consequently, these farmers believed they were being gouged by the railroad companies in terms of the rates. One of the practices they cited, for example, was what they call long and short haul rates. That they will be being charged different rates depending on how far the railroad needed to bring their crop. They were being charged more per acre of crops for transportation in short hauls than in long hauls. If you only had to ship from southern Illinois, or let's keep it all, put it in interstate, from the state of Wisconsin to the city of Chicago, for example, which isn't that far since Wisconsin sits right north of Illinois, right north of Chicago. But in the process, when you go to Chicago, you're changing states. You're going from the state of Wisconsin to the state of Illinois. So suddenly it becomes an international commercial issue. But if you're in Wisconsin and you're shipping to Chicago, it's a short trip. The farmers argued that they were being asked to pay more per unit, whatever that was, pound or acre or whatever, for the short haul, than if they shipped it from, say, Minnesota to Chicago, which would be twice as far away. And so they argue that they were being discriminated against, that the rates were being adjusted based on existing circumstances. All of us are used to this. Look at gasoline prices. Look at the difference at the pump between what some people pay and what others pay. When we get the price of gasoline, for example, we've gotten a lot of this because of the travel over the recent Thanksgiving holiday. And the number we was given was the national price per gallon of gasoline, which is $2.04. But the fact of the matter is, many places are paying well under $2 a gallon. Other places are paying quite a bit over $2 a gallon. I know here in West Virginia, for southern West Virginia, for example, here in the Beckley area, we're paying $2.19. And you can go into some of these rural areas, not far from here, and the gasoline is $2.03, $1.99, etc. So basically, the rates charged are generally regulated, but many people believe that the situation is ripe for abuse. That's what the farmers believed in the late 19th century. And so many of the farmers went to the state legislatures and they tried to put pressure on their state legislatures to get legislation favorable to farmers, which would regulate railroad rates. And many state legislatures, under the pressure of the farmers, were forced to give in. Many states passed laws regulating rates. The railroad companies challenged these laws, these so-called Granger laws, in court. And they went to the federal courts. And in the late 19th century, in a series of cases, the courts ruled on the right of local legislatures to regulate rates. And of course, the companies were arguing that it was their property, the railroad. And therefore, legislatures did not have the right to determine what they could charge for their property, access to their railroads. But in a very, very famous Supreme Court case in 1877, the case of Munn versus Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that while property rights are important and they do apply, in this particular case, if your property is invested in providing a service to the general public, in other words, if your property is in serving the public, then the interests of the public take precedence over your right to private property. In other words, in 1877, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in favor of the Grangers, in favor of the farmers, by ruling in favor of the states which had passed laws to help out farmers by regulating the rates of railroads. And not only the rates, but also the storage facilities. Many railroad companies owned the silos in which crops were stored. And farmers argued that they were being ripped off in terms of the storage rates as well as the transportation rates. In 1877, the Supreme Court ruled in Munn versus Illinois that when there's a conflict between the private rights of property and the public interest, the rights of the general public, the rights of the general public must always prevail. So therefore, Munn versus Illinois upheld the constitutionality of the Granger laws. At that point, the railroad companies turned to the federal government for relief. And they began to argue for federal regulation of rates. And obviously the railroad companies believed that it was easier for them to influence the federal government than it was to influence individual state governments. So basically, the railroads turned to the federal government for relief from what they believed was overly heavy state regulation of their businesses, of their private affairs, business affairs. In 1886, in another case called the Wabash case, the Supreme Court reversed its decision in Munn. It was a different makeup of the court. It was 9 years later. There were different justices sitting on the court, a conservative majority on the court, and the court's ruling this time went in favor of the railroad companies. And the Supreme Court in Wabash ruled that Congress is given the power by the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce. The only rates that the state legislature of Illinois could regulate was traffic within the state of Illinois itself. But the minute that traffic crossed the state border into another state, it became interstate commerce, and that meant that the state legislature in Illinois was no longer qualified to regulate rates. To regulate the rates of interstate commerce, the Supreme Court argued in Wabash, would be to violate the constitutional power to regulate interstate commerce that the Constitution gives to Congress. Only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. So in response to that, the farmers were forced to turn to the federal government for some sort of regulatory relief. And in 1877, Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission, whose principal responsibility was to study railroad rates and recommend fair rates for everybody. In the early 20th century, about 25 or 30 years later, Gabriel Kolko, a student, a historian, in his dissertation, argued that while the Interstate Commerce Commission and some of the other agencies that created of the federal government were seemingly there to treat all parties fairly and to represent the best interests of citizens, in fact, the Interstate Commerce Commission and many of the other new agencies were controlled by the industries which they were created to regulate. What Kolko found in relation to the Interstate Commerce Commission, for example, was that most of the members of the Interstate Commerce Commission had staffs made up principally of railroad attorneys, railroad lawyers. They wrote the rules. In fact, what Kolko found is that railroad attorneys wrote the Interstate Commerce Act. The argument, the rationale being that Congress wasn't qualified to write a specific piece of legislation dealing with the regulation of railroads and the setting of rates and the charging of storage rates and all the rest of it. The only thing that Congress could do is turn to the industry itself, turn to the experts. And so they went to the legal minds within the railroad industry for suggestions and recommendations on the kind of agency and the kind of powers that that agency ought to have. So Kolko's argument is that the agency created to regulate the behavior of railroads was actually written by, was devised by, and controlled by, and the rules were written by the industry itself. Which, if you think about it, supports Justice Thomas's, George Will's point that these bureaucracies, because of their monopoly of expertise, because they have all the experts, they are given by Congress the flexibility to make the kind of rules and regulations that will work for that particular industry. So in a sense, the whole nature of bureaucracy is to turn to the experts to make up the rules of regulation. You turn to the industry that is being regulated. Gabriel Kolko found this in the late 19th century and published it in the early 20th century. Needless to say, his dissertation wasn't received well, because basically what he was suggesting is that whereas the federal government appeared to be responding to the real needs of people, in fact, it was totally being controlled and regulated by the corporate interests that it was supposed to regulate. This was, in many ways, the beginning of what George Will has referred to as the administrative state, which, as Cooper tells us, now consists of over 450 different agencies manned by more than 2.5 million federal employees who regulate everything. George Will said they regulate every aspect of our lives in this modern age. So what we need to spend time on, and I know we're getting right towards the top of the hour. In fact, we're within 3 minutes of the end of our program today. It's 57 minutes after the hour. Where we'll be going tomorrow, then, is looking at this idea of the administrative state. And we'll go back and look at the founders and what the founders might have said and what they thought in relationship to this kind of an issue. But I think for today, it's time to wind up our program on this Monday, the 30th day of November in the year 2015. I want to thank all of you for your time and your continued support for the Virtual Center and also for the Head On Radio Network, especially for the Head On Radio Network. I know that there are some fundraising issues that Bob Kincaid and his folks have to deal with. I do ask that you do all you can to support the financial needs of this network. I want to thank you. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. Remember, tomorrow is Tuesday. We'll be beginning 1/2 hour later, 1:30 in the East on Tuesdays. So our program tomorrow will be 90 minutes rather than the full 2 hours, the full 120 minutes that we had today. And then Wednesday we'll be back to our regular 2-hour format. This is Bill O'Brien. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Be good to each other. And please think about joining us and encouraging others to do the same here at the Virtual Center. Thank you so very much. Have a good day.